For some brief context, I'm a 22-year-old female, and the following events occurred when I was 19 to 21. When I moved away for college, I started talking to the Catholic priest, Father Gabe, who ran the chapel and women's shelter behind my dorm building because something scary happened to me, and I really didn't know who else to talk to. Plus, he was literally like 100 feet from my bedroom window. Anyway, long story short, Father Gabe is the exorcist for the vast surrounding areas. He's also a demonologist, and he was born and raised in Rome. He studied there. He's also super old, like 87, and he's super broad-minded as well, considering that he's a priest. I feel the need to specify that I'm not an overly religious person. I'm more spiritual, and my basic belief system is that there's something greater than us that our minds just can't simply comprehend, and that this entity we label as God, well, that's there, and it does exist. There are things that are beyond our control that are sometimes malevolent. Now, demons isn't really the right term for them. It's the only term that we've come up with, but they are very evil. So basically, I think that every religion in the world has a piece to the puzzle, but none of them paint the whole picture. Last, it's important to explain the reason I began working with Father Gabe on his cases. For the sake of space, I'm going to be very clear. I have a sixth sense, and my connection to the other side has always been very strong ever since I was a small child. It runs in my family on both sides, so I guess you could say I was kind of physically born into this, for better or worse. I told Father Gabe about this, and after testing me numerous times, he asked me to help him with an extremely violent case. I agreed, and without much hesitation, that's where my story begins. The victim of this was a 7-year-old boy. For his own privacy, I'll just call him Danny. Danny has been acting very strange for the past few months. His parents had taken him to numerous doctors, psychologists, specialists, etc., but they were never able to diagnose anything wrong with him. His mum, Sarah, was a nurse, and the family wasn't particularly religious, but Sarah's parents were convinced that they had to take Danny to the Baptist church and they needed to see the pastor. Though the pastor knew that something was horribly wrong with this kid, but he didn't have the necessary skills or knowledge to help him. That's when Father Gabe got called. Now, the memories are kind of fuzzy. It's been a few years, so I really can't remember Danny's whole story, like when the weirdness started and how things escalated to the point that they did. But I do remember listening to an audio recording of Father Gabe's first interview with this kid, and there were multiple voices talking with some different languages. Just unnatural weird stuff. Anyway, I'll skip to the investigation proportion of this story, although a lot of crazy stuff happened then. It wasn't like the actual exorcisms, it's just weird. Now I'm going to go into detail with the most intense, terrifying parts and gloss over everything else. So the first exorcism attempt. Danny is strapped down to his bed with hospital restraints and hooked up to an IV because he stopped eating and drinking. Sarah, being a nurse, was able to get these things fairly easily, so I went there thinking, oh, that's alright. We won't have to hold him down like in those crazy movies. But I was so very wrong. Real quick, the way a Catholic priest's exorcism goes is sort of like a mass. Basically, there's a part where the priest says that they're gonna do a part called the congregation. It's mostly just echoing whatever the priest says, and Father Gabe performed his in Latin. It can be done in English though. So Father Gabe starts reading from his Roman rites book, and the younger assistant priest, Rendell, as well as myself, were all reading along with him. Not even a page in, the kid starts struggling violently against his restraints, and when he realizes that his wrists and ankles are strapped down, his spine bends backwards to the most unnatural arch that I've ever seen before. His face was almost against his stomach. He bites the IV connected to his arm and tries to rip through it with his teeth. I'm not lying. Blood splattered everywhere and was spraying from the bottle like in a horror movie. I then had to drop my book to go and help Father Randall. That's Roy, Danny's dad, and Hurdle, Sarah's dad and Danny's grandpa, hold Danny down while his mum was bandaging him up. Skip forward to the fourth attempt. We're all worn out. Danny obviously the most, but we have to power through. So we start the exorcism and things start going crazy. The power goes out and one by one the candles in the room are blown out. Now I'm afraid of the dark, so the moment this happens I'm already on my knees trying to find my flashlight, desperately searching. I do find it quick though, but by then the room is pitch black and strangely silent. My hands are shaking as I fumble around trying to turn on the flashlight when suddenly I smell rancid meat and a deep, guttury voice asks me in a mocking tone, "Are you afraid, Noel?" Directly into my ear from just over my shoulder. This made me instantly leap up and let out a really loud scream. I was terrified, dropping the flashlight to the ground in the process. When it hits the ground, it turns on and the beam of light darts around the room, bouncing off everything, briefly illuminating Danny. He's now standing in the centre of the bed staring directly at me. He has the most disturbing smile that I've ever seen. This instantly made me fall down to my knees, and I start blindly feeling around for my flashlight that I can no longer see since it went out as soon as it flicked on. I find it soon though and flick it on to see that Danny's no longer standing on the bed like he was less than a second ago. I shine the light around and much to everyone's shock and horror, we find him crammed into the 1.5 foot wide gap between the top of his bookshelf and the ceiling. His body is contorted and he's crying, confused as to why he's up there, and obviously he's in a lot of pain. All the men help to get him down and just like that, the power come back on. Now skip ahead again to the 7th attempt. I'm not even sure if this kid is going to survive this alone, and he's just getting more and more terrified and it's leaving me emotionally rattled. We're halfway through the exorcism. I see that the main entity that's been inhibiting Danny's body suddenly appears. It's squatting on top of Danny's chest, staring down at him laughing. Its skin is inky black, so that way it absorbs all of the light that hits it instead of reflecting it. Everything about his body is long and thin. The fingers are long as well, coming to sharp points at the end. Not like claws, just like only continuous pointed digits, if that makes sense. It looked like a skeleton wearing a skin, only much thinner though. Its skin was razor sharp too. Its mouth was full of razor sharp teeth, and its eyes. There are no words in any language on earth that can describe such militia and horror. Already being emotional, I start to lose it. I start to yell at that thing to get off Danny and leave him alone. Everybody probably thinks that I look insane since I'm the only one who can see this thing, but I keep on demanding it goes. Then it looks at me, but I'm so angry that I fight the urge to cower in fear. This time, it just looks at me and it says in that ungodly voice, "Don't get angry, it's all just a game." Then this thing sinks into Danny's chest. He's just absorbed the entity. I'm still working on processing what just happened when I hear a loud metallic snap. It didn't take me long to realise the sound was Danny's right hand restraint buckle, because he suddenly sits up and slowly turns his head until he's staring at me. Once again, his eyes are completely black and his face is scratched into the most horrific smile. There's a tense moment of silence before Danny's mouth opens. In his own voice he says, "Do you want to play a game?" Now before I even get the chance to answer, both the power and candles are extinguished. I feel a gust of wind blow past me and listen as the other members of the party are slammed into the walls and shelves behind us. I'm freaking out by now. I reach for my tiny flashlight that I clipped to my belt loop to avoid being caught without it, and then I realise it was no longer there. How's that even possible? My mind goes into absolute panic as I hear the sound of a metal cap unscrewing and 2 thunks on the hardwood next to Danny's bed. Flashlights are against the rules, I hear Danny say with a giggle. I'm obviously borderline terrified as I squeak out to Father Gabe, "What are we gonna do?" All I hear is him groan out in pain, and suddenly Danny shouts out, "They aren't allowed to play." I'm almost crying now and I ask, "What do you want?" Another giggle, "To play." Then, on come the lights. I'm almost blinded by the sudden exposure of the lights to me. I can't see a thing, but I can hardly believe what I'm seeing. All the males in the group are pinned up against the wall, obviously unable to move. Sarah and I are just staring at each other with the same scared expression. Suddenly, I hear a low growl come out of Danny, bringing our attention back to him. He just isn't smiling anymore. He looks downright evil. He says, "I thought I said lights were against the rules." He snarls, his voice reverting back to the deep growl one. Now from across the house, I hear Danny's grandpa, Laurie, yell and flip that the circuit board just went back on. Danny flies into a rage. He starts thrashing wildly while yelling, "You broke the rules," over and over again. Sarah and I move forward to pin him down and restrain him once again when he suddenly stops flailing. There's a toxic pause before I hear him whisper in a barely audible voice, "Now, I'm gonna break something." And then, his body starts contorting in the most unnatural way that I've ever seen. He then twisted and twisted, and it put massive amounts of stress and strain onto his left shoulder, as if he were trying to pry himself out of the other restraint. It then clicked to us exactly what he was trying to do. Sarah and I jumped on him, trying desperately to hold him down. I'm not ashamed to say that by this point I started crying. Sarah and I struggled to stop his twisting body from winding any further, but to no avail. I'm 5'7" and 130 pounds. I'm by no means a pushover, and Sarah was only a little smaller than me, but as we were trying our hardest to push him down, we were both crying, and at this point we realised we couldn't do anything. The one thing about all of this that I will never forget the rest of my life, Danny's left shoulder suddenly caves in, retching downwards into the socket with a sickening, unmistakable pop, and just like that, he was back. The thing left him to feel the pain of the shoulder that he'd literally just dislocated. I've never heard another human scream like that. I doubt I ever will. So, this is where I'll stop. I had many stories, but I just wanted to broad stroke the most terrifying and traumatizing of events that took place. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but I thought that others might find this story interesting. This world is full of both darkness and light. This experience gave me a glimpse of both.
A year ago, me and my husband bought an old house in the northern part of our country. It is an old farmhouse with the previous residents completely redoing it. There is a large piece of land which was used as an agricultural spot for animals and fruit trees. This plot is more and more transformed into a garden by former residents. A part of the garden is a vegetable garden. I love this garden so much. I lived in the city and had no real talent for plants, but last year I learned a lot about growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs. I love to grow my own vegetables. They taste so much better. In front of our house is a road. One side is toward the center of the village and the other to the next village. The road leads through a piece of nature. It is a big old house with a large garden. It has a lot of windows, sunlight, and warm feel to it. I feel really good, peaceful, and comfortable in our new home. It is big because the former stables are drawn into the house. Our bedroom is the upper part of the old stable. There are windows, and the view is great. My husband and I were in love with the house, and I still love it. My husband not so much. He feels watched in the garden, especially at night, and during the day he gets a strange feeling in the garden. In the evening, and sometimes in the daytime, he pulls the curtains closed in the rooms with the windows to the garden. In summer, he does not like to sit in the garden. The terrace in front of our house is okay, but not the second terrace. In the other part of the garden, this is unfortunate, because the terrace has a fireplace. He will go, but he cannot relax. I teased him often and said that he acted like a little child. I feel wonderful in the garden, and I have no problems with it. I never really believed him until he got a new job. This new job asked him that he must travel sometimes and stay in hotels. These nights when I am alone, I always wake up because of the sound of snoring. I open my eyes and there's a creature laying next to me, asleep, snoring. Sometimes with his back to me, sometimes on the back, and sometimes on his stomach. Once he woke up, smiled at me sleepily, and went to sleep. He does not cause me any harm, except wake me up in the morning. He has green skin, black lips, and large pointed ears, and long black hair. Sometimes it is bound and sometimes it is braided, and sometimes stuck together with many golden clips. His hands are like an animal. He dressed in a white shirt and black pants, and his posture was average. The one time he woke up, I saw all black eyes with no whites, and he smiled yellow sharp teeth. I can see this because I always sleep with the lights on when I'm alone. I never like the dark. Normally I fall asleep again because I'm very tired. I feel spooky but no fear. I do not want to tell my husband because I don't want to frighten him, and I'm sure that he will sell the house. I want to know for sure that it's not a dream, but if I tell him, I'm not sure what he'll do. I hope you can help me. I don't want to lose my house.
I live in a high-rise building. Now the building itself is from the 1950s. There's all kind of stories about how this place is supposedly haunted. I never believed any of this. Well, that is until last night. I was having the worst dream ever. I mean, it was horrible. I dreamt that I was asleep in my very apartment. I woke up and there was a face staring at me through the window. As I went to speak to it, it literally come through the window and started attacking me. Just a second before it actually got to me, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat. Now, all of the lights were off in the apartment. Now that didn't make any sense. I would never do that normally. I always make sure I leave at least one on so I can see where I'm going when I wake up. Out of curiosity, I went to look at that window. You know, just how you do sometimes after a dream, going to check out the stuff you dreamt about. That was when I had the most terrifying experience of my life. As I went towards that window, I could see that there were two blobs on the window. I thought that they were just hand marks that I had left there from looking out of it earlier. I went to wipe them off, but nothing. I then got some spray and tried still to wipe them off. That's when I realised that the handprints, they're on the outside of the window, and them hands were way too big to have been mine. Also, did I mention that I'm 50 stories up?
A bit of background first. The following story happened when I was 22 years old, so 6 years ago now. At the time, I was working at a psychiatric facility, doing general admin stuff. The area I worked in organized training programs for frontline staff. It was my first job out of university, and I was hired because I had a mental health related qualification, but the job itself had pretty much nothing to do with that. It was really boring stuff, lots of copying, filing, and spreadsheeting, etc. I was the youngest person in the office by quite a bit. I think the next youngest was early 30s at the time, and most people were 40 plus. I got along well enough with everyone, but I didn't really have work friends, if that makes any sense. We had flexible working hours, which basically meant that you could come in any time between 6:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and leave after you'd done your 8 hours or whatever. I was young and quite the night owl, so I usually rocked up at 9:30 a.m. and left at around 5:30 p.m. I was often alone in the office for at least an hour or so at the end of the day, as most of the other staff opted for the start early, leave early approach. The facility where I worked was quite historical. For ease, I'm just going to refer to it as the Center, a collection of heritage-listed buildings, many of which had been repurposed over the years. At the time I was working there, the primary purpose of the center was forensic mental health. So they had high and medium security areas where patients were housed behind secure fences and etc. They also had non-forensic patients and residential rehabilitation units on site. So, this basically meant that a number of patients were free to wander around the place for the most part. Once or twice, we had patients come into our area, but we never had any major trouble from them. The area where I worked didn't have anything to do with patient contact, and our building was on the outskirts of the center, furthest from the high secure area. Our building was a big grassed area out in the back where we were allowed to park, and just to the side of the parking area was an old, dilapidated building that was, probably still is, pretty popular with local ghost hunters. Apparently, they couldn't knock it down because it was heritage listed, but they eventually erected a big fence around it and took the floor in the upper level to deter people from snooping around and hurting themselves. This didn't necessarily stop them though. I remember security being called at least a few times when we noticed people hanging around and trying to sneak in through the fence. The old haunted building had apparently been a ward originally, but had closed sometime after a big flood hit the area over 100 years ago. Now, to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure on the accuracy of these details, but from what I was told during the flood, the center was cut off for at least a few days, stranding workers and patients. And during this time, that particular building flooded and a number of patients died. Anyway, regardless of how true the patients dying in the flood story is, the whole place is creepy. It is a historical psychiatric facility after all, and naturally attracts a lot of ghost stories and urban legends. People have of course died over the years, with some standout cases, including a young female patient who was lured off-site by two other patients and brutally murdered back in the 80s. So you get the idea, it was an eerie place to work. Our building, like most of the buildings in the center, was heritage listed, and I was told it was originally been a ward for male patients, which they'd repurposed into an office setup. It was divided into 4 wings. The managers had individual offices in one wing, which had apparently originally been solitary confinement rooms. There was an office space next to the manager's wing, which was used occasionally by another service, but they weren't there much, so it was usually locked. Next to that was a main admin wing, where I was working from the time. And finally, the main office wing, where the rest of the non-admin staff worked. Now, to travel between these wings, you had to walk outside, as none of them were connected internally anymore. There were old glass doors connecting the couple of areas, but these had been painted over and repurposed as wall space. As you can imagine, staff weren't immune to the eerie vibe and haunted history of the center, and most everyone who worked there had a strange story, or a few, of strange occurrences and ghostly happenings. I've always had an interest in all things spooky, but in my advanced post-university years, I'd adopted a mildly Scully-esque skepticism toward the paranormal. My interest was still keen, but I was no blind believer. The stories were fun, but after working there for over 6 months, often alone early hours of the evening, I'd never experienced anything, especially ghostly. So, with all of that information in mind, I'll get to my story. On the evening in question, I was the last person left in the office, with everyone else having left by around 5 p.m. It was winter, so it was getting dark fairly early. By 5:30 p.m., it was pretty gloomy. Despite a lack of ghostly happenings during the past 6 months that I had been working at the center, I wasn't immune to the creep factor of being there alone after dark, and I was planning to leave as soon as I'd finished a big load of copying I needed to have done by the next day. I was printing a bunch of training manuals, and every so often I needed to go empty the printing tray, as the printer automatically stopped if there was too much paper stacked up. The industrial printer I was using was stored in a room in the manager's wing, so to go collect the printing I needed to walk outside, down a short ways to the entry door to the manager's wing, then down past some offices to the printing room. The first couple of times I walked down to collect loads of printing, nothing out of the ordinary happened. All of the doors were unlocked, so I just walked out with my wing, down into the manager's wing and into the room with the printer, where the door was open. On the third time I went to collect the printing, however, I was troubled to find the manager's door wing was closed and locked. I fetched my keys and unlocked it and walked inside and up the hall to the printing room, which was strangely locked as well. I unlocked the door, collected the printing, the printer was still going at this stage as well, and went back to my wing, feeling a bit uneasy. I reasoned that perhaps the security had come to check on the building and locked up for the night. This would have been very strange though, as the lights were clearly on in my wing and the printer would have been running, so for them to lock up without checking my area, where it would have been apparent someone was still working, would have been very strange. Strange but not beyond the realm of possibility, I figured. So I decided I'd stick around till my print job was done, despite feeling a bit creeped out and starting to consider the possibility that perhaps my colleagues' stories of eerie occurrences weren't just watercolor fodder. After waiting a while, I went to collect the next load of printing. I was shaken to find the door of the manager's wing had been once again inexplicably locked. With keys in hand, I unlocked it, walked to the printing room, which was, at this point unsurprisingly, also locked. I unlocked it, grabbed the printing from the tray, and fled back to my wing with considerable haste. Leaving both doors wide and open behind me, back in the comparative comfort of my work area, I once again considered the possible explanations for what was going on. Again, the only thing I could come up with was that the central security had come in locked up. But whilst that was a possibility, albeit unlikely, in the first instance, it was becoming increasingly unlikely given my subsequent trip to the relocked doors. I really didn't want to go back into the manager's wing again, as by this point, I was truly wigged. By something as innocuous as a couple of locked doors no less, but despite my rising fear, I needed to grab the final load of printing, and ironically, ensure the wing was locked before I left. I doubted. I was scared of spontaneously locking the door. Was going to be viewed as an acceptable excuse if I hightailed it out of there, leaving the printing incomplete and the building possibly unlocked. With the keys in hand, I returned a final time and was initially surprised but relieved to find the door of the manager's wing wide open, just as I had left it during my previous hasty exit. Relaxing a bit, I entered the hallway and walked down to the printing room. However, my heart sank as soon as I saw the door to the room was closed, and sure enough locked too. I quickly unlocked it, ducked in to grab the printing. However, while I was doing this, I heard a noise from somewhere down the hall. It was a scratching sound, and then sort of a murmur. I ran, slamming the printing door behind me. I rocketed down the hall, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something dark, moving down at the end of the corridor. As I ran around the corner and through the outer door, I locked the door quickly, ran back to my wing, dumped the printing on my desk, grabbed my shit, and got the hell out of there. I literally ran to my car. The spontaneous door locking was one thing, but creepy noises, even if it was just my imagination, that was definitely getting a big nope from me. The next day I told a couple of my colleagues about what had happened, and they were sympathetic but ultimately didn't seem terribly surprised or skeptical. It was just a creepy place, and weird things happened there sometimes. After this incident, I tended to come in a bit earlier for a while, so I wouldn't be left there alone at night. Eventually, the fear factor wore off though, and I wasn't too worried about it anymore. There were other occasions during the years that I worked there where strange things would happen. I'd hear voices talking in the next wing to where I was working, even though everyone had left for the day. A few colleagues reported experiencing this too, and odd noises which honestly could have been anything but seemed creepy in context. My uncle worked in the center too for a time, and he recounted how he and a colleague once had been working late at another building on site when they had suddenly heard what sounded like a waterfall roaring down the halls in the room. He said it went for several minutes, and it was deafening, before suddenly just stopping. He never could explain what caused the sound. If I had to put my skeptic hat on, looking back at my printing room experience, I feel like the sounds I heard, the scratching and the murmur, were definitely real, but I'll accept I could have misidentified the sound of something mundane as something more sinister in my already heightened emotional state. I was pretty terrified by that point. To be honest, I probably didn't actually see anything. I suspect it was just likely my fear clouding my judgment and subsequently coloring my memory of the incident. The locked doors, however, 100% legitimate and fairly inexplicable in my opinion. As I said, it was a pretty creepy place. I almost missed working there.
It's almost 5 in the morning right now. I am wide awake. It's the most wide awake I've ever been. I'm an atheist and don't believe in any of this, but what I saw has truly grabbed my attention and chilled me to the bone. I was having a completely random dream. I then woke up, staring at my sliding closet door. The moment I woke up, the closet door slid open, as quietly and smoothly as it possibly could. I jumped out of bed and yelled, "Hey!" turned the lights on. Nothing. I turned on the lights throughout my apartment. My doors are locked. Everything is normal. I then looked in the closet and there was nothing. I slid the doors open to see if it was a gust of wind, but nothing of the sort was there. It actually made some creaking sounds when I opened it and closed it. How on earth could it have possibly slid open the way it did without making any sound? The other thing that doesn't make sense is my bedroom's at a slight angle. It was literally defying gravity to open the way it did.
During my senior year of high school, I would normally sleep real late into the night. Since my room was on the second floor, it provided me with the privacy I needed, without anyone disturbing my conversations. I was a teenager who enjoyed talking on the phone with friends, and calling from bed was the perfect time to gossip. My younger brother at the time slept upstairs as well, but he slept in the room next to mine. On one particular weekend night, which has haunted me to this day, I was in bed talking on the phone with a friend. Everyone in the household was sleeping since it was late into the night. There was enough moonlight coming into my room that I could make out the outlines of the objects that were in my room. My bed at the time was in the corner of one of the walls, while the door was at the right of my bed. I was resting my eyes for a while during my phone conversation when I had an uneasy feeling. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow standing next to my bed. Even with the moonlight, the shadow was dark, and I could not make out any features. I just stood there, while I felt my body freeze in horror. My gut told me that this was a malevolent entity. After staring at this figure for what seemed like an eternity, the entity shifted into a shape. I saw it transform a two-legged shadow to a four-legged creature with a tail. When it did this, it crawled on my ceiling near my bed. My room ceiling is low due to the shape of the roof. There is a slant to the ceiling on the edge, so you can hit your head on it if you're not careful. It is at this moment that I threw my phone. My friend was still on the line, jumped out of bed, and went for the light switch next to the door. I did not look back at the creature out of fear. When I turned on the light, it turned off in a matter of seconds. I turned it back on again, and it turned off again. I felt my adrenaline going after I failed to keep the light on, so I threw open my door, turned on the light in the hallway, and frantically knocked on my brother's door. I woke up my brother that night, and although angry as soon as he opened the door, he looked concerned when he saw me crying and shaking terribly. I told him what had happened and what I'd seen in my room, and I quickly tailed him behind to check my room, and retrieved my phone. When he turned on the light from my room, the light stayed on. We did not find anything but my phone still on the bed. Apparently my friend had tried to call me several times after that, but I cut our conversation short due to what I had seen. My brother believed me, probably from the way I was acting and looking, and he wanted to tell my parents, then and there. It was pretty late in the night and I didn't want to wake them. I also knew they were not going to believe me because they are hardcore skeptics. I realized that they were just going to dismiss it as a dream, and I told my brother not to say anything, and I ended up staying in my brother's room that night. I could not sleep at all that night due to the fear and due to the questioning of exactly what that thing was.
Hello everyone, this is a story from my grandmother from when she was younger in the late 60s. She and her friends decided to use an Ouija board to try and talk with spirits. They're all non-believers. So they got ready and all three of them put their hands on the moving thing. They then asked, "Who's there?" And the piece then started moving. Then my grandmother said that she let go and told her friend, "Hey, stop moving it, it's so obvious." And her friend said, "I'm not moving it, you are." And they tried again. This time, they asked it, "Who's there?" And the same thing happened. My grandma told me that she felt terrified. She said she really didn't know what to believe now, and instead of a name, the board spelled out a phone number, and my grandma was freaked out. None of them dared to call it. They asked, "Whose number is this?" Then it started to move once again, and this time it spelled out, "Call this number and tell Joseph not to travel tomorrow." My grandmother and her friends were horrified by this because none of them knew a Joseph, so they tried calling the number, no answer. Again, no answer. So they all decided to go home and call it a night. None of them called, but my grandma did the next morning at around 8 AM. She called and there was a woman. My grandma said, "Hello, can I speak to Joseph?" And the woman said, "He's not here right now, he went to work. Who is this?" My grandma explained the situation and the woman said, "Oh my god, I'll call you back when I've told him." The next day, the woman called up again and was crying. Her husband Joseph died on the way to his work in a car accident that sent him plummeting off a bridge into a river. My grandmother was deeply saddened by hearing this. She vowed never to use an Ouija board again. I got a story that I rarely tell because of how much it scares me. At the time, I was 18, just graduated high school. I didn't go college right away. I took a break and picked up a second job instead. For my second job, I worked third shift, that's 10 PM to 5 AM, with 4 other people on a rotated schedule. That's no more than 3 a night and sometimes 2 a night. After a few months, I become friends with my co-workers. We'd take smoke breaks and eat lunch in the back room playing music, etc. Honestly, it was a really chill job. I actually really enjoyed it. Working at night can mess up your brain, I realised that. However, my body completely adapted and I always felt energetic and ready to go to every shift. At this point, I should probably say that when we worked, all the doors were locked and there's absolutely no way to get in or out without triggering the nightly alarm. So on one particular night, we showed up just before the manager left for the night and locked up. He then told us that it would only be my co-worker, who I'll call Mike, and I, as our schedule. Jake, as I'll call him, called in sick about an hour ago. Me and Mike had no problem. I was probably closest to him because he was my age and he had my dad as a teacher at his school. We start our usual routine with walking around the store with my manager to ensure nobody else is there. We have to then go and check every single door and watch him alarm the doors on his way out. We decided the first order of business was to smoke a cigarette in the back of the warehouse. We never had a problem with accidentally setting it off because it was so high up. Here's where things get wild, now stay with me. Me and Mike pulled a pallet stacked with boxes out from the warehouse and onto the main floor. I grabbed a dolly with some boxes of dried goods and headed to a different aisle so we could be ahead of schedule. We always typically split up for efficiency. About 15 minutes pass and I head back to take more boxes. The pallet was in a central point in between us. Neither of us were in the same aisle as it was. When I got there, I saw a bag of chips and dip opened up on the pallet with obvious dip marks. We would often eat from this and just leave cash at the front of the cashier so that way they could go and sort this out in the morning. Our manager was fine with it. Mike met me at the pallet and I was loading up on my second trip. I then started making fun of Mike for grabbing them because it just seemed like a really weird thing to grab. He then looked into my eyes with this deadly serious look. His face had now changed. "No, that's yours." Apparently my face did the same when I told him that it wasn't mine either. Obviously Jake was pulling a prank on us or something and the manager went along with it, right? No. At this point we both decided to be logical and check the store to catch whoever was doing this. We both have goosebumps the size of mosquito bites on our arm and we just try and laugh it off. But obviously something was wrong. Way wrong. It just seemed a little colder and we both were on edge. We sweep the warehouse in the back and the break room, etc. No dice. We're now getting closer to the front of the store. There's only one entrance to the store. It's right near all the 12 registers we had. Now in the front, there's this big metal rack. That's where we sold the charcoal for the grills and also those big logs that burn really slowly. As we walk inside of it, we hear a loud sound and 3 logs suddenly fly off the shelf. I'm not gonna lie, I screamed and it made Mike jump. We're freaking out at this point, but I stopped and convinced him to walk to the shelf with me so that way we could check it out. With 2 adults, each over 170 pounds, we realised that we couldn't even budget. Someone or something obviously threw it off with great force in front of our faces. We walk around the store again trying to figure out who or what was causing this, any excuse to blame this on, and we find nothing. We then decide the best thing to do is continue work and listen to loud music. We work together for the rest of the night. Here's the craziest part. We're getting done a little early, so at 4:50, about 10 minutes earlier than we should have, and we started goofing off on those electric scooters for the handicapped people that are in front. It's critical I tell you this next part. The front had big glass windows, so that way you can see both in and out from the parking lot. We kinda just didn't talk about what we saw after it happened. I went to sleep that day and woke up to a call from Jake. He was practically having a panic attack. His mum, who worked there during the day, was one of the ones who come in at 5. She was older. Jake told me that just as we clocked out, he started talking to her and she said, "Who was that by the door?" It kind of looked like a person, but it was more like a black mist, just in front of you guys on the scooter. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep. Mike and I never worked alone after that. I later found out that Mike had a whole history